critical issue for South Africa and focus on the issues related to impacts and adaptation. And maybe by way of introduction to say that the question of adaptation, climate impacts, and also for a number of countries, loss and damage remains an absolutely critical issue for any successful COP outcome. But the feedback that we've had is that in the negotiations, as has been the case in the past, these issues are not receiving the airtime or the seriousness that they deserve. And I think that means if you look at the gains that have been made from a developing country's perspective in relation to mitigation and other issues, that there's a very long way for us to go in terms of the ability to A, do the work, B, get the work out into the public, and C, make an impact in the international environment. So the program today has a set of really interesting events and really interesting speakers. And I really hope that we can take the content from today and look at how we as a country, and I suppose we as a continent, take the excellent work that is being done and be able to feed it into this UNFCCC process in a way that ensures that we elevate the issue of adaptation to be treated as seriously as the mitigation work that takes place here. So with that, I want to welcome everybody and hope that we have a great day of conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne, for those words of welcome. Indeed, adaptation is a very important topic for South Africa. We are a climate hotspot, and it's a great pleasure to have quite a representative group of people online to talk to us about some of the initiatives that are taking place in the various stakeholder bases. I'd like to call on Mr. Tlo Ramaru from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, who's going to give us an insight into some of the work that's taken place at government level. Noting that the National Adaptation Strategy has also been recently approved by Cabinet. Tlo, are you on the line? Are you able to switch on your camera?
Thank you, Retro. Just checking if I'm visible and audible.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, you are. Yes, thank you.
Now, thank you so much, Redu. Just to check, I've put together a very two succinct presentation slides. I just want to check if it's visible as well, then I can go ahead.
Yes, you can go ahead. We can see it and we can hear you clearly. Just remember to put yourself on presentation mode.
Great. No, thank you so much, and thank you, colleagues, and thank you firstly to Johan and NBI for the really for this good collaboration and partnership. Thank you to colleagues that are on the program, our partners, Sanbi, Indalo Inclusive. Thank you to GIZ, and thank you to the government of Flanders for the ongoing collaboration that we are having as far as implementation of climate change adaptation work is concerned. I've just put very briefly a slide just to really cover the policy landscape for climate change adaptation in the country. And I agree with Johan, adaptation remains one of the critical issue, even at COP26. And we are hoping that during the discussion, they would be able to raise the bar on adaptation, covering, of course, a number of elements, one being the finance for adaptation being one of the critical elements. But again, the issue around the operationalization of the global goal on adaptation remain one of the important key issues from our perspective. And back home, we have been doing some very interesting work that really pave our implementation of our adaptation initiative. On the policy landscape, the policy planning, we have the National Climate Change Response White Paper, which started to provide the policy direction that enable us to really focus particularly on the adaptation component in as much as it covers both adaptation and mitigation. We, of course, developed the climate change bill that is currently in the parliamentary process. And in the bill, there is a component on adaptation where it, of course, requires national sector department, provincial department, and local sphere of government to do adaptation planning and undertake as well the risk and vulnerability assessment. As Redu has already alluded to, we have developed the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy that has been approved by Cabinet, and the strategy becomes the key instrument that informs planning across the country. It outlines very clearly key strategic areas and the strategic sectors, which are inclusive of energy, biodiversity, water, tourism, among others, to really guide the country and galvanize collaboration across the different spheres of government, the different role players, civil society, business, academia, to really join hands in implementing adaptation measures in the country. We, of course, have been rolling out support for the development of sectoral climate change adaptation plans from different sectors: health, human settlement, biodiversity. And this is part of our mainstreaming work, where we want to mainstream the consideration of climate change into the planning processes. We have, of course, supported our provinces, 9 provinces, to develop the adaptation strategies. And we have, of course, started to see some results coming out of that support, where provinces are now gearing themselves to implement the provincial adaptation strategies. At the local level as well, all our 44 district municipalities in the country, we have assisted them in undertaking risk and vulnerability assessment, but most importantly, in developing the district adaptation plans. And we have developed the national framework on climate services. Climate information become very central to adaptation planning, and we collaborating with different entities, with, of course, the leadership of the South African Weather Service, to help us in generating climate information, ensuring that there's early warnings that can reach the communities, and ensure that we create interface and platform where the climate information producers and the climate information users are able to exchange and easily access information. We, of course, have updated our nationally determined contribution. And in the nationally determined contribution, we have communicated our first adaptation communication as one of the key instruments that, of course, will be central going forward in terms of implementation. And corresponding to this policy work, we have, of course, programs that are aiming at implementing this national adaptation strategy. We have the local government support program, working with our partners. We are doing quite a lot of things: capacity building, project development support, technical support, research support for this local sphere of government, so that they are capacitated. Similarly, we are supporting provincial government through our provincial government support program to assist them in terms of the project development plans. We're working with our national treasury as well to support through the Cities Resilience Support Program to ensure that we support cities, among other things, in terms of technical support, project preps as well. We have an interesting facility that we have put together within the department, and you're going to get a detailed brief on the Adaptive Capacity Facility. This is the facility in the main that become an instrument of implementation, where they are testing some of these policies on the ground, piloting some of the innovative innovative solutions for adaptation on the ground. You'll be hearing quite a lot from my colleague Jonathan on this. Working, of course, with our colleagues at SANBI, we're working on the development of the pipeline with the view, of course, of accessing some of the resources within the multilateral financial setup. And on the scientific support, we have developed what we call the long-term adaptation scenario. This is the research work that give us the projections and tell us what will the climate look like in the foreseeable future, and be able to also provide what adaptation intervention will be required. We have developed the National Climate Information System that enable us to collect all the necessary information and interventions that are ongoing across the country to help us to understand the breadth and width of our implementation on the ground and assess the impact. We have, of course, the climate change adaptation research strategy that we are trying to galvanize support from the various entities working together to ensure that we continuously do research work for adaptation, working with DSI, Department of Science and Innovation. We're working with our different research entities to leverage that collaboration, but build a partnership towards research on adaptation on the ground. Just in terms of the partners, and I think most of the partners are here, they will also be making interventions. We, of course, working with civil society. We are working with business, we are working with academia, research institutions, the state entities, but most importantly, we're working with our donor partners and other financiers that are enabling us to can really drive implementation of this national adaptation strategy. And in the main, some of the elements that are covered include the whole issue of climate information, early warning system and observation, risk and vulnerability reductions that we would do through these partnerships, technical support on project preparations, mainstreaming climate change into the policy and planning sphere across the various spheres of government. Research and development becomes one of the key areas of collaboration, as well as capacity building and awareness. I will stop here just to ensure that I details as my colleagues will be presenting some of the key pragmatic approaches that we affected so much.
Thank you very much, Flo, for giving us that great overview of the policy framework for adaptation in South Africa. And you've already started linking to some of the other presentations that we will be having as part of this event. I'm happy to now introduce Mr. Jonathan Ramaya from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment as well, who will be talking to us about the adaptive climate, the adaptive. Jonathan, I'm gonna let you give us the correct name for that.
Okay, thanks so much, Lutumetse, and thank you to NBI for providing the platform. It's an honor to speak to you, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world today logging on. So I will share my screen. I've got a presentation. So just confirm if you can see that.
The presentation is coming up, so I'm sure it'll be on screen. Yeah, so we can see the presentation clearly. Just remember to put yourself on presentation mode, please.
Okay, thanks so much, Lutumetse. So good afternoon, good morning. I would like to present to you today on the Adaptive Capacity Facility, specifically on the Human Settlements Pilot Program. And this slide just gives a brief background to the Adaptive Capacity Facility. It is receiving funding through the government of Flanders, part of the country strategy paper for that time period that you see there. The entire program's worth 25 billion euros, and the ACF is receiving 3.99 million of those euros. Just in terms of where we sit in the department, you can see there we're within the branch Climate Change and Air Quality in the Chief Directorate Climate Change Adaptation, and we have a newly established directorate called the Adaptive Capacity Facility, and we're working together with one of our sister directorates, the socioeconomic sectors, on the ACF Human Settlements Pilot Program. So our functions and the mandate really of our program is for us to enhance climate resilience through our work. And the focus really is on reducing human vulnerability. And we want to build adaptive capacity of people and of local governments through transformative and systemic climate change responses. So our functions really, the first one is the most important, to operationalize this program that I'm going to talk about. And then we've got other things that we look at, for example, the stakeholder-driven transformative adaptation agenda and supporting in mainstreaming climate change into human settlement planning and delivery. The fourth one is something that we will explore into the future, but just looking at the potential for an adaptation project preparation facility or a research mobilization office. This slide just shows the result areas as per our project agreement. The two highlighted bits there, number 2 and number 3, is where the bulk of the budget and the effort is really going in. And in particular, the orange shaded result area, number 3. Number 4 and 5 are quite standard on projects, so they should be quite standard on adaptation projects. We'll be generating quite a bit of knowledge and know-how through our project, and M&E becomes quite critical around seeing whether the interventions are effective or not. This slide shows the background or the policy framework and how we actually approached the design of our projects. Obviously the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy is what we've been guided by in terms of the overarching framework, but there are 6 building blocks there, and quickly go through them. The first is whatever projects we decide on through our program, we want them to be sustainable. We want them to have a life beyond the project period. Prioritized action for the most vulnerable is really important to this approach. We want to build on the work that's already been done within our chief directorate. And I think one of the foundations here is also around testing what the policy is saying and ensuring that there's that feedback loop, in particular at a local level. And I think very pertinent to this discussion today is around action-based partnerships. That's something that we are trying to explore, and it will be based on the specific districts that we'll be working in. And I mentioned knowledge generation already. So we actually came in with a clean slate, but there are 3 parameters that we have established for our project. And we have decided that we would want to have a project in each of the 3 human settlement typologies that we've identified. And you can see those up on screen there. So we'll be having a project in each of those typologies in 3 districts and across 3 different climate risks. So, learning is an important aspect, and we don't want all our projects to be the same, basically. I want to go through our activities leading up to implementation of our projects. It's been a long process up until this point. The green dots there are basically the activities that we've completed. The orange one is where we are right now, and then activity 6 is where we're heading towards, that we haven't quite got there yet. But the first step for us was that initially the program was going to be a call for proposals, where we put out a call and we have respondents to that. But we challenged that approach because we thought that in that approach, one often receives the best, or at least proposals where people have time to respond to these. The best writers of proposals respond to them, rather than the finance or the support going to where the need is greatest. So what we did as part of the first activity was an analysis of the risk and vulnerability assessments across all 44 districts in South Africa. We quantified that, and we came up with the 10 most climate vulnerable districts in the country. And then we went to the second activity, which basically it was a pre-screening. It looked at these 10 most vulnerable districts, and we shortlisted the 3 districts that would be included in our human settlements program. And the reason why we included the second activity was because we wanted to ensure that we were selecting districts that had the ability to implement, that did have some capacity, that had a favorable climate change policy, because it is external donor funded projects, and we did not want to increase the risk of failure of these projects if we selected just any of the districts. So activity 2 is quite important. Activity 3 then saw us go to the different districts and select the different sites that we'd be working on. It didn't quite work out that way because some of our interventions are across different sites. And you'll see what I mean just now, but that was activity 3. Activity 4 really was one of, I think, one of the approaches that we would like to share internationally and nationally. And this is really our co-creation process, which I'll get into just now. We've completed that. And now we're moving towards procurement, which is not the most fun area or the most fun activity. It involves a lot of administration, but we're really interfacing with our departmental procurement system. And it's, we're going to be putting that one to the test quite soon. So you see the time frame around that one. And then finally, we look at activity 6, which is around implementation of these projects in 3 districts. Now, the 3 participating districts in our program are Amatole district. You can see the location of that district there. It's around Buffalo City, the metropolitan area. And it is the sites that we're actually going to be working on is between Butterworth and Idutwa. And this is where the Kalinka Dam catchment is located. And this is our peri-urban project. And the risk we're dealing with here is drought. The second district is Garden Route district. Here we're dealing with wildfires, which is unsurprising given the issues that have been faced there over the last decade or so. And this is our urban project. So, this district has quite a rural character, especially in the hinterland, but towards the coast is where the built up areas are. And this is going to be selected as our urban project. And then lastly, the Umzinyati district, which is in KZN. And this is our rural project. It is going to be focused on flooding and lightning. Okay, so a little bit more about the co-creation workshops. You'll see some pictures there. I can talk through them, but basically, in summary, what it involved was a little bit of sitting in workshops and discussing, a little bit of site visits, reviewing different technologies, having a variety of stakeholders there. So at the top, you see Mr. Gussein Isaacs from Western Cape Province. You see there the house. This is the fireproof house that we visited. On the right, this was a memorial that was put up for family members who had lost their lives in the fires of 2017. Bottom left corner is a lady from Old Mutual, Lisa de Beer, Mutual and Federal Insure, sorry. So, the private sector has a particular, story to tell when it comes to the risk of fires in the area. And the picture on the right there is where we had a look at a fire break within the Knysna municipality. So our co-creation workshops really started with us trying to understand what the projections and what the science is saying. And this really formed an important part of the climate rationale of each of the projects. And we repeated this for all 3 districts. I'm just showing you Garden Route for the interest of time. When it comes to fire, the 2 weather variables that affect the risk of fire or increase the risk of fire is increasing temperatures. And you'll see that on the top graph there. And it's clear that all the models are agreeing that temperatures are increasing into the future within this district. The graph at the bottom shows precipitation, and most of the graphs there are agreeing that, or models are agreeing that there will be less precipitation. So this will increase the risk of fire in the area. And we then established that climate rationale of the project. But it's not all about the science. It's really also about trying to understand how the risks are being experienced in terms of impacts on the ground. And we spend quite a great deal of time in our co-creation workshops understanding the experiences of people. And it's not just about loss of property, loss of lives. There's still a psychological impact that people have till this day, 4 years later, after the fires. The community is basically traumatized. So we try to gather all of those impacts and hear firsthand from the project, who would be the project beneficiaries. And we looked at the impacts quite widely and grouped them thematically. You can see that there. And then from these variety of impacts, we then started to take each one of them and understand or propose interventions that would reduce the risk of that impact or build adaptive capacity. And you can see the range of interventions that were proposed there. So we grouped them all and we put that to a voting process. Not very scientific, but this was important just because a voting process allows for people to buy into the interventions that are being proposed, so that the project has a better chance of surviving and being accepted by communities. So on the left there, you'll see a pic. It was, quite a fun exercise, quite a stressful exercise, maybe a lot of conflict there in that district. But eventually these were the interventions that were chosen for the Garden Route district. The first one is early detection and monitoring, with a series of cameras that we will place around the Garden Route district. The second set of interventions was around fuel load management. So with fires, the more fuel you have, the greater the risk as well of fires, having damage to property and loss of lives and things like that. So that project revolves around construction of fire breaks between the vegetation and communities, and the urban-rural interface. And then the third one was around firefighting training, or will be around firefighting training for a variety of stakeholders. So this, I'm going to show you a video, and it doesn't matter if the sound doesn't come through, but it was part of our co-creation process where we went up in a chopper and we just surveyed for sites to locate our early detection cameras. It's a 1-minute video. Okay, so there you'll see that, some of the watchtowers already in place. What we'll be doing is just installing cameras where there are towers, and in some cases installing the masts as well as the cameras. And this slide here, it's actually from a project that is run by Sanbi in Ngundlovu district, but it's private sector run by the forestry sector. What you will have is a number of screens, and you have operators monitoring the feed that comes from these cameras, and it really makes a huge difference when you can catch the fires in the incipient phases, so that there's response and that you don't have too much destruction happening there in those areas. So our project basically will, the cameras will be run and operated by the Garden Route district. This is my second to last slide, and I think just because we're talking about partnerships here, I thought it would be interesting or useful to highlight the different partnerships that we have on our project. So first and foremost is with the funder, and this is really largely defined by the project agreement. I think what's unique about the government of Flanders is that they are providing us as a department an opportunity to implement projects directly ourselves so that we can learn and that we can inform policy. And this is not often the case. Often you find funding that comes in that provides funding for technical advisory work, and I think this is a really good opportunity. So, a big thank you to the government of Flanders for that. Support has been provided in project conceptualization and design with the funder, especially in the early stages. But of course, that partnership is really dictated by the project agreement. Our second partnership is with local government, and I've gone through this. It's defined through a memorandum of understanding, and what we look for there is reliability of these local governments, the districts, and there's also a balance that we have to strike between learning by doing and then the ability to implement. Provincial government has played quite an interesting role, in particular in the Eastern Cape. We don't have a defined partnership instrument there, but strategic guidance and strategic partnership for the possibility of scaling up these different interventions, province-wide instead of just within a district. And then with line ministries, we've got representation of line ministries, especially the human settlements and cooperative governance and traditional affairs on our PSC. This is around capacity building. It also should be around mainstreaming of climate change into sectoral focus. We found a lot of aspects or areas where, how you plan your human settlements has a huge impact on the level of risk within these different communities and based on the different risks. and they all have different dimensions based on what the actual risk is. The fourth one, or the fifth one, is our partnership with community-based organizations. And we have, for example, Indalo Inclusive represented on our PSC. And they've been supporting us, or they will embark on supporting in further development of the projects, particularly those with an economic spin-off. So one example is when you remove vegetation to create fire breaks, you could use that vegetation to create desks and things like that. And then finally, with the private sector, we have NBI represented on our PSC. The partnership is still to be defined, and it's based on specific sites. And I mentioned the example of the garden route insurance sector there. So my last slide then. Okay, so what are our next steps? Well, I've mentioned that we're going to embark on procurement in activity 5, and then project implementation in activity 6. So that's the end of my presentation. You see the 3 districts and the different projects and interventions we'll be working on there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for giving us that overview of the Adaptive Capacity Facility Program that the department is running with a range of partners supporting the implementation of that program. I think it's fitting that after having identified key issues and key interventions in those various municipalities that you mentioned, we will now be moving on to speaking a little bit more around the mobilization of climate finance from the Green Climate Fund, and particularly accessing these funds directly. I'd like to hand over to Dr. Mandy Bonnet from the South African National Biodiversity Institute, who's going to speak to this topic around direct access mobilization of GCF funds.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Retu. Can you see my slide?
Not yet. We see you very clearly.
Okay, let's see if we can make you see my... What's happening on my screen? Share screen.
Your slides are coming up. We can see it clearly now.
Do you see it in presentation mode, or do you see
yes,
it in?
Is.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so hi everybody. It's really fantastic to have the opportunity to be here. I'm sorry I'm not able to be at the COP in person. I'm certainly this year feeling the difference that in-person engagement makes. But I'm grateful for the virtual and hybrid opportunities that have been created. I'm from representing SANBI, the South African National Biodiversity Institute, and we are a direct access entity of the Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund. And it's a pleasure today to be able to present our role in the climate finance architecture of South Africa and the contribution we're making to get climate finance to the ground where it can make a difference. So before I get going, great thanks to the NBI for creating this platform for us, and to the department, DFFE, for enabling us to have this opportunity. So starting off, if my slides will cooperate. Oh, now hold on a sec. Sorry, colleagues. I don't know why I can't. There we go. Okay, you can see the next one. Retu, can you?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so what I have on the screen here, colleagues, is an extract from a paper that was produced recently for the Global Commission on Adaptation. SANBI was one of the authors, and it had a look at the climate finance architecture system, and it asked the question, why is the money not getting to the ground? We know that a lot of money is being mobilized in the international space, not enough compared to what the commitments and ambitions have been, but nevertheless, a substantial amount of money is being mobilized, and it's on balance, not making its way to the ground where it will have an impact and make a difference for those who are most impacted by climate change. And what we did in the paper is we analyzed the broken connections and the barriers that hinder the flow of funding to the ground. And we called this gap or this blockage the missing middle. And what we discovered was that in order for funding to make it to the ground, the whole system needs to work. which means the funds need to be set up in a way that they are actually enabling of, in particular, in terms of our focus today, adaptation action on the ground. We need to have accredited entities who are able to access funding in a way that it articulates national and subnational priorities. We need to have a national designated authority that is able to be active in the policy environment and make the connections between the funding opportunities and international policy and national policy. We need to have subnational actors who are empowered to do this work. And critically, we need to have communities who are involved, engaged, resourced, and have agency to develop and drive their own adaptation responses. And the image that's on the screen now shows you all the crosses are where the system is broken in the international space, and where we need to be working in order to make the climate finance system work. We are very fortunate in South Africa that a lot of the red boxes, the red crosses, are actually not there, because as you'll see from the conversation today, there's quite a lot happening across the different partnerships that enable us to move from the international space through the national policy space. Claude just described it, through different experiments around implementation and mobilization, like Jonathan has spoken to, and then through the work of SANBI as an accredited entity to try and get this finance to the ground. So I'm zooming in today, colleagues, on the teal box, which is the role of SANBI. We are accredited for the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund, and have been working in the space of mobilizing climate finance since 2011, when we became accredited by the Adaptation Fund. So my next slide, I hope you can see it, is an image of what we've been doing for the last almost 7 years, working with Adaptation Fund Climate Finance through a participatory process where we called for proposals and built some capacity. We were able to get 2 projects approved by the Adaptation Fund. The one on the left-hand side, which is calling it project number 1, is a project that builds resilience in a catchment in an area of KwaZulu-Natal. It's one of our districts that has quite a rural receiving environment. And in this project, we're working with subnational government, very important partnership with district municipality, to develop early warning systems, to support small-scale farmers, to work with climate resilient agriculture, and to work with climate-proof settlements, including built and ecological infrastructure investments. Very interesting project, teaching us what works and what doesn't work in the subnational environment, where we have capacity gaps, and also giving us quite a lot that we can build on for a project that we're planning to scale with the Green Climate Fund. Lots of tangible impacts coming through in that project. The second project was a small grant facility, and it was the Adaptation Fund's very first, what was called an enhanced direct access project. And what this meant was that instead of it just being direct access, which was money to a national entity like SANBI, it was enhanced direct access because we were able to program that funding after receiving it. Most of the time, the big multilateral funds program their climate finance that every single dollar or euro is programmed before the contracts are signed. And enhanced direct access, increased autonomy is given to the subnational level to be able to do the programming. And in the small grant facility, we pioneered small grant making for climate change adaptation in 2 districts in South Africa, subnational government level. We supported the implementation of 12 projects through a tiered governance system with a range of partners, and delivered 3 times the number of direct beneficiaries than were contracted in the original project proposal. So altogether, 1,800 people having benefited directly from their small grant investments, and a lot of learnings around what works, what doesn't work, how do we need to scale this in a more friendly way going forward. It's important for me to mention that both of these projects are governed through a national governance committee that includes, among others, our Treasury, our Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, relevant civil society representatives, as well as the private sector. The infographic on the right-hand side just shows you one of the projects that was supported by the small grant facility, almost 100 direct beneficiaries, over 1,000 indirect beneficiaries, and really amazing tangible impacts and lessons for scaling, not just in South Africa, but beyond. So today, in the middle of my presentation, I'm very happy to announce that right now, right here, we are launching our learning products from the Small Grant Facility Project. There are 9 case studies that really delve deeply into the learnings and experience of our local partners. And they're available at the link that's on the screen on SANBI's website. Very exciting. I encourage everyone who's part of this call to have a look at them and to share them. And very importantly, to note that these lessons are informing a blueprint for scaling up enhanced direct access through SANBI's Green Climate Fund program of work. So if I was there, I would hand you out copies and we would all clap. But of course, we're working in this virtual way. So colleagues, please have a look at these and really, give the honor to the small grant recipient partners who really walked this road with us and taught us what is needed in order for us to get climate finance to the ground in a way that it is responsive and a way that it is supportive of the very people who we're trying to support with this funding. So moving along into SANBI's Green Climate Fund program of work, we've been very busy since 2016 when SANBI was accredited with the Green Climate Fund. We're developing 7 project proposals at the moment. 3 of them are formally in the Green Climate Fund system. The first one, I won't go into detail on this at all. I just want you to get a flavor of what SANBI is doing, is on ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. The first one, ECO-DRR, looking at flood, fire, and drought, and how investments in disaster risk reduction and ecosystem management can reduce the vulnerability of communities to flood, fire, and drought in South Africa. The second project is an ecosystem-based adaptation project that's looking at farming, and it's building on and scaling up the lessons from the first Adaptation Fund project. And the third project that has formally been submitted into the system is one that is looking at ecosystem-based adaptation for water security and the securing of 11 of South Africa's 22 strategic water source areas. And I think you'll all appreciate that as a climate change hotspot, water is a strategic and critical issue for South Africa. The other projects that we're working on are looking at coastal resilience, coastal environmental infrastructure, groundwater recharge, a project that will start to work into the just transition. And I think we've all heard a lot about the just transition over this COP. And very importantly and very excitingly, a brand new grant facility for locally led adaptation that will enable us to bring climate finance to the ground at different scales, all the way from smallholder farmers that might need a very small investment to help them implement different agricultural planting mechanisms to the kinds of things that Jonathan's talking about in the climate resilience program. It's a very exciting program of work. We're hoping that in the next year or 2, we'll start to see some of SANBI's projects be approved, and that we'll start to be talking about the implementation of Green Climate Fund projects in addition to the development of the pipeline. I do want to really acknowledge the government of Flanders here, because in addition to readiness money that we've received from the Green Climate Fund, we have been incredibly fortunate to receive funding from the government of Flanders to support the building of institutional capacity to mobilize the development of this pipeline. And I think it's a very interesting modality and a very interesting pilot, and something that should be looked at the international level by the funds themselves in terms of supporting direct access. Because if you're bringing new national or subnational actors into the space of developing projects and proposals towards them being funded, there needs to be resourcing for the institutional capacity that is needed for that. So second last slide, colleagues, just a couple of principles that inform our work. Because SANBI is accredited in the Green Climate Fund space for grant-based finance only, that looks at adaptation and mitigation co-benefits, we always have a pro-poor and gender-just agenda. A lot of our work is about integrating knowledge systems, so bringing what we know as traditional science into the local level and looking at local and indigenous knowledge and how we bring those things together. Really incredible learnings and lessons coming from the Umgeni Resilience project that was funded or is funded by the Adaptation Fund around that. We're mainstreaming climate change into plannings, policies, and development. You heard a lot about that from Chloe and from Jonathan. We absolutely are embracing the emerging principles for locally led adaptation. And critically, we're engaging and empowering subnational government to receive the baton from us and be able to bring climate finance to the ground and make the impacts at different scales that are so critically needed in our vulnerable communities. So colleagues, thank you so much for the opportunity, and especially so much to the South African partners who are generous and incredible and amazing and cooperative as we try and figure out how to build and mobilize this entire system all at once under quite a lot of pressure.
Thank you very much, Mandy, for giving us, some of those insights and really help sharing with us what has come out of the various initiatives that SAMBI has been implementing, and the emphasis of on ownership and really being able to get the benefits down to those who are most impacted and affected by climate change. I'd now like to call upon Mr. Rest Kanju, who's from Indalo Inclusive, to speak to us a little bit more about the collective civil society responses that he's part of that are supported by the government of Flanders. Rest, you're welcome to go ahead. We can see your presentation.
You can see my presentation. Good
Yes,
afternoon.
we can.
I think it is a good afternoon. Thank you so much. My name is Rest Kanju. I am with Indalo Inclusive South Africa. We are very grateful to be part of this event. And I do think that I will try and not take too much time. And I hope you can see my screen and can hear me very well. So as an organization, Indalo Inclusive, we operate specifically in South Africa and work at supporting what we call eco-inclusive entrepreneurship. And that's kind of an entrepreneurship that focuses on, triple bottom line impact in the social and green space, and ensuring that the enterprise that we support do have a very strong, economic impact on the ground. We've been in operations now for a number of years, and we're grateful to the government of Flanders for the grants that they've been, supporting us with. And yeah, I'm asked to actually speak specifically on the issues of collaboration among civil society organizations. And I think I'll just get straight into it, possibly after this slide. And like I said, we're working with the government of Flanders on implementing a project called Exige, which is an acronym for a very long name that stands for Reaping the Potential for Eco-Inclusive and Climate-Smart Entrepreneurship for the Green Economy in South Africa. In the past 3 years, where we've been, implementing in different landscapes of the country, there's a number of, entrepreneurs that have benefited from this work. And I've just put up on the screen, just a couple of numbers and figures that demonstrate impact, maybe quantitatively at this stage, and we're looking at a wide range. I must just also mention that we work at a stage of entrepreneurship journeys that are basically quite risky for investment, and our objective is to really try and look at developing early stage entrepreneurs and through what others may call a pipeline, and we intervene with various tools, among others, including helping entrepreneurs bring into a stage of proof of concept their ideas, specifically in the social and green space. We have made a number of grants in this particular regard, and so far just under R1 million of investments at this early stage in entrepreneurs that we support, and we still are going to be issuing possibly another just about R500,000 in the next few months, and all of this is supported by the government of Flanders, and we really are grateful on that. Now, in our 4 years of operation and since the Exige project, we believe that, and I think this is evident through the attraction that we've received in the landscape. We believe that we have really amassed a lot of partnerships and are beginning to create a lot of impact, and all of that is through the partnerships in the ecosystem that we enjoy. I think if I were to come straight into what I've been asked to talk about, imperatives of civil society collaboration. I think many a times we talk about the issue of collaboration as a key issue in the landscape where we're operating, but it's not as easy as we want to perceive it. We're very grateful and lucky that we have, as an organization, amassed quite a lot of support and are able to collaborate with a number of enterprises, of organizations within the landscape. And I must just say that, collaboration becomes quite important, because if we deal with climate adaptation issues, there's a number of issues at stake. Two of these, it falls within the ambit of what I would call a double whammy. We're dealing with climate adaptation issues. Communities have to be resilient. We have to adapt the already existing impact that we see. And while we're doing that, we have to also start thinking about issues of just transition. Both these concepts actually have a direct bearing into the livelihoods and well-beings of communities. And in the South African context, these have become kind of key priority in the different dialogues that we have, but also just in terms of policy, it becomes quite strong and imperative that we deal with this with urgency, and we need to have focused attention. Specifically, if you look at communities that, as Jonathan has mentioned, that have been identified as possibly facing the most vulnerability and risks as a result of climate change. Also, we're dealing with a number of issues, and if we have a global goal of ensuring that adaptation does strengthen resilience and reduce vulnerability, we need to note and recognize that this is about livelihoods and well-being of communities. We can talk, we can discuss these things in conferences such as these or in different platforms, but I think what is at the back of our mind all the time, it has to be an attention that needs to be focused towards ensuring that our communities, have as well-being it's intact and livelihoods are protected. And therefore, I do think that if there's anything that I need to bring, forward today in terms of a message, is to actually basically draw to our attention the fact that we do need to work together as civil society organizations. There's just no time to work in silos. There's just no time to think in our little corners if we are to achieve, really protection of communities that already are vulnerable in different aspects, drought, floods and disaster, fire included in that. Now, if we come into what I would call the imperatives of collaboration, why is this important? So I think at a high level, one of the things that we need to recognize and really start talking about is that we need to adopt what I would call a developmental ecosystem building model. Because I think that the success of projects on the ground, the success of the entrepreneurs that we're trying to support really depends on, as I've said, and I will keep on, going back to this particular point, it really depends on the existence and active working together of all elements of the system. And in this regard, partnerships. And in my next slides, I'll demonstrate some of the work and the possibilities that exist in this particular space. The government of Flanders, in their design of the 5-year program, specifically around the theme of climate adaptation, identified a number of beneficiaries in this program, which are actually autonomous. But what was quite critical in this program and for the success of this CSP3 program of the government of Flanders, at the center of it, what we need to recognize is the fact that if we don't collaborate, if we don't work purposefully, and if we don't work deliberately towards establishing partnerships that will then lead into benefits of communities, we're operating in vain. By the time the funding comes to an end, by the time the support of other institutions and partners come to an end, this will be stuff that we'll never be able to build upon in the future. Whereas if we are able to try and find synergies amongst ourselves, the opportunities of growth and leveraging and in fact more meaningful impact on the ground are basically extended, and it eventually benefits not just us as organizations, but communities for the greater good of society. And I must just also say that when we collaborate, systems of collaboration that don't need to be perfect. So if we want to look and identify opportunities, we don't have to wait for something that's perfect. We need to work on each other's strengths to enhance outcomes and expand the pie. Many times we wait for that opportunity that says, if I give you something, then there's a lot of benefit on this financial return on this partnership. It does not have to be perfect. I think we need to recognize that. what matters for me and for us and the work that we do, it's how do we start in this collaboration effort, and how do we start somewhere, and how do we ensure that there is activities on the ground. And I'm drawing a bit of lessons from the early stage of the work that we're doing with the government of Flanders and the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. And I do think that one of the things that we should think about as a civil society organization is an ability for us to share information. We need to create these platforms for information sharing. If we don't share information, we would not know how we're going to be collaborating. And I'll give on the right side of my slide a couple of examples of these platforms that have been created. In the beginning of the CSP3 program that the government of Flanders has been supporting, grantees meetings were very instrumental in allowing us, and at least from our point of view as an organization, Indalo, to learn from others, to understand what others are doing. And in that regard, we were able to then identify these opportunities and how best to actually collaborate. But it's not just an issue of sharing of information. We need to actively pursue these partnerships. So follow through and follow up, becomes quite important. And most importantly, there is a need for, what I would call a performance management or reporting on these partnerships. We are very fortunate as Indalo that the government of Flanders allowed us to really look at a specific component in our program that, seeks to bring about what I would call a broad program development in our approach and work. So therefore, we're able to report on it within our grant management system, but also within our work in growing out the organization and work interacting with the entrepreneurs and communities on the ground. I must also then recognize as well the platform created through the Adaptive Capacity Facility of DFFE, the fact that we sit in the project steering committee and we interact with a number of organizations, including NBI and SANBI, that brings out a lot of information within that space. And I don't think that we are harnessing that opportunity enough, but I'm excited to always look at these opportunities, and I always want to make sure that we pursue them. We work quite closely, for example, the IDC, the Industrial Development Corporation in South Africa, who also developed a very interesting model of looking at, harnessing expertise from different organizations that within the ecosystem to influence and provide technical input in the selection of funding, interventions in the areas where they are working. We also, as an organization, have a platform called the Indalo Inclusive Symposium, which is an annual event where we really always want to bring different stakeholders and partners. And I find that this kind of events begin to be quite instrumental in stimulating at least the fertile ground for these collaborations. Because I think, again, the issue has got nothing to do with us. It's about increasing, a critical mass of expertise and models in areas that are vulnerable and suffering and are impacted upon by climate change specifically. And I thought maybe I wanted to spend a bit of time here, and I was asked to look at an example of how we are collaborating as an organization on the ground. I get excited, for example, with the presentation that Mandy has just given, and leading up to, following from Jonathan. If the DFFE has provided and has done extensive work specifically around identifying the 10 vulnerable districts in the country and shortlisting about 3 of them, I think logic for me says that we need to begin to support that work. We need to begin to ensure that the work that we do kind of congruates into those spaces where the DFFE has identified, because we bring different expertise and different interventions, all of us. And as an organization, our role and our mandate looks at how best do we bring our entrepreneurship support tools on the ground to stimulate market-driven approaches and assist communities to use these tools and instruments to access funding and support, but most importantly, implement sustainable and viable projects. So, I put up this slide here to just give you an idea of the kind of relationships that we have through the Exchange and the Government of Flanders supported program. If you look at this on the outer circle, there's a number of organizations that we've enlisted there. All of them and all these that we've listed here have directly benefited from the government of Flanders climate adaptation program of work. And we've been fortunate that we've got very formal and collaborative partnerships with each one of them. So for example, if you look at the K2C biosphere, implementing some great and exciting work in the Greater Kruger landscape and supporting what we may call a landscape approach using the Greater Kruger National Park as a springboard for that. We work quite closely with them, support early stage entrepreneurs around the Greater Kruger area. We work with Conservation South Africa, who are partners in this particular program that's funded by the government of Flanders. We work a lot closely with UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, as well as UNDP and Gender CC. And in fact, as a result of our collaboration in this space, we recognize the gap that there is a need to support women-led climate change adaptation efforts. And then we run a program that looks at specifically recognizing that. And what we do, basically, we put together our resources. So there's clarity in terms of reporting and meeting our targets. If you look, and I can speak a bit about the Department of Forestry, Fisheries, Environment, DFF's Adaptive Capacity Facility. I'm actually connecting to you right now from the Garden Route municipality, which is one of the 3 district municipalities that the ACF has identified, specifically trying to respond on risk, on fire as a risk issue. We're bringing successful entrepreneurs in this space to identify these problems and then develop interventions and mainly looking at possibilities of using climate finance instruments to ensure that there is implementation of real and sustainable activities on the ground that are long-term and working with local entrepreneurs. And we work with Wildlands Trust, in the northern parts of KZN. That becomes exciting because we bring in these tools that otherwise, as a program, as an organization, Wildlands we don't necessarily have, but we do. We work with WWF, also funded, by Flanders. We have a formal MOU with them, supporting their cooperatives in the coastal communities that are involved in various fishing activities, and ensuring that there is long-term and sustainable entrepreneurship development within that space. And I've mentioned the IDC as an example, as a state-owned development corporation in the country. IDC constantly looks for opportunities where they can look at investments. But one of the biggest challenges that they kind of constantly have is how do we access a pipeline? So we currently are developing a pipeline, working with about 10 enterprises now to get them investor ready. And again, we're bringing the focus of the work that we do. It's on eco-inclusive entrepreneurship. It's really working specifically on opportunities for entrepreneurship in the climate adaptation space. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, the idea for us is to demonstrate in this slide that it is possible to work together as a collective of civil society organizations that benefit from donors such as the government of Flanders, but most importantly, support efforts of government, because government then has an obligation not just to its own country, but also to the conventions and protocols that they adhere and sign to, and they have to meet those commitments that they have signed. And we actually come in to provide additional impetus and ensure that there's fuel and real activities that are implemented on the ground and not just talk. And this is what I call connecting the dots. Of course, there are benefits around this thing. And just to quickly mention something that you possibly already know, at a high level, and most importantly, the adaptive capacities of communities is definitely enhanced. We work in rural communities where there's very limited resources and especially institutional capacity at the ground level. When we come in and work at a particular district, we're bringing a number of skills and models. So complementarity of programs becomes critical. The benefits and opportunities are optimized. We leverage on each other's resources. And there's, like I said, multiplicity of models and skills. Of course, there are challenges as I conclude. Each organization has its own, internal processes of governance, while, it's not easy to pursue partnerships when you have a log frame to complete and to tick and report to your donor, but also have corporate governance issues in terms of getting into this kind of partnerships. Those sometimes become an impediment. We need to find a way as individual organizations to deal with that. Sometimes there's competition of resources. A lot of us possibly want to hold on to that which we have, and if we have an opportunity, we want to grab and become masters of all trades. And that is a risk of us becoming, basically, jack of nothing. We can be master. We can't necessarily be master of all trade. And I think maybe the generic problem that exists is the fact that we hardly put in budgets, budget allocations to ensure that there's pursuance of partnerships and collaborative efforts amongst ourselves as organizations who benefit either from the same donor or benefit from different donors. So there's just because there's no budget, therefore there's no time for those kind of activities to pursue partnerships and collaboration. So I do think that in our program designs and in our work, it becomes critical that we are creative in how best we can collaborate with others. I do know that I was a bit rushing, but I think that concludes my presentation, and I just really want to thank all of us and for giving us an opportunity to present. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rest. I think you've demonstrated that partnerships are alive and well and thriving. But now to look to another key stakeholder in this conversation. So we've looked, I think, at government, we've looked at civil society to get a private sector perspective on the role of the private sector in catalyzing climate responses in South Africa. I'd like to call Mr. Steve Nichols to come up and provide us with some of those thoughts.
All right, good morning, everyone. Let's quickly going to get up the presentation. So I thought what I would do is talk through some of the lessons that we as the business sector have learned over the last sort of 8 to 9 years of running adaptation programs of business, and maybe be a little bit frank. We've not been as successful as we would like to have, and I thought I'd sort of analyze some of those things, but also just share the potential that we think exists for us to work on these programs. So jumping straight in, a couple of key insights over the last decades that I'll illustrate with a few examples just now. We have the skills and knowledge to solve the problem. However, people don't really apply their minds unless it's subject to some kind of facilitated process. In the business sector, you don't really have people who are dedicated to focus on adaptation like you might have in other sectors. And so there is a bit of a challenge in terms of getting people to focus on that particular topic. But when people do apply their minds, they come up with fantastically innovative solutions, and we'll show you some of those. A key thing to getting people's attention is simple storytelling. Adaptation is complex. Getting people to engage on it is really challenging. And so you need to come in with something that gets people's attention and really gets them motivated to think about adaptation in general. Project pipeline remains the biggest challenge. We hear this over and over again, like we do in the mitigation sector, that there's finance available. However, it's not taken up because there isn't a pipeline of good and effective projects. And then we're still thinking small, and so we'll look at some of the numbers. But I think if we're going to really generate an impact in the adaptation space, somehow have to really take advantage of all of the collaboration, all of the expertise that you've seen so far today, and really scale that up. But we're talking hundreds of times. So before I jump into some of those key examples, some context, the business sector, certainly private sector, can't get involved in all kinds of adaptation and nature-based solutions. And certainly there are things that can be done that can help drive action to more unified understanding of the problem and a more unified set of goals. But really, the business sector is most effective if there's some kind of cash flow that you're able to finance and to work with. When you're funding a deferred cost, it becomes much more complicated. And many nature-based solutions fit into that category. And the example that I always like to use, in South Africa, there's a road that runs along the coast in Cape Town. And that road, the sand dunes often encroach on it. And currently the budget sits with the sort of operations and maintenance division, who own a gigantic digger, and they move along that road clearing off the sand dunes. The best solution is to plant plants along the sand dunes that sort of lock them in place and doesn't have that large encroachment on the road. It's much cheaper, it's nature-based, but the budget to come for something like that is very complicated to do within that structure. So those kinds of problems can be solved, but the more extreme cases where you're funding big deferred costs in nature are very difficult to work with. And sometimes you just have to use policy measures in order to protect these assets. So just that caveat up front. The other context piece is companies identify significant value at risk from the physical risk of climate change and the need to adapt. It's not as great as the transition and sort of economic risk that we see. But if you look at the data identified by companies in the CDP disclosure of 2018, you'll see that 274 billion Rand value at risk was identified, and across a number 152 different risks identified. And I guess what's key to note there is it's only 6 or 7 companies that identified those risks. So if you extrapolate that across the economy, physical risk and the need for adaptation is an enormous thing. And then to the kind of numbers. So this is some work that was done by the Climate Policy Initiative, the Birth Center in Green Cape, looking at finance flows across mitigation and adaptation in South Africa. And you can see the bar for mitigation is enormous. The bar for adaptation is tiny. And then there's some that have dual benefits, but most of those are driven by mitigation projects that happen to also have adaptation benefits. And so if we think about the COP language, that adaptation and mitigation are as important, there's a huge amount of work to do to scale up investments in adaptation. So some of the key insights, going back several years, this is a project we did in 2015, looking at green economy finance. And there were 2 kind of key things that came out of that. One is that if you get people together, you can often get quite a useful common framing about how we think about resilience and natural capital. And in this project, what we did was we ran multi-stakeholder workshops around the country, asking people to identify the key characteristics of a functioning and healthy economy. And resilience and natural capital came up as 2 of the key things. But what we found is a really good alignment on what these ought to be, and in particular, starting to look at what are the kinds of natural capital ecosystem-based economic contributors that exist. And I think we think about adaptation very much as a biodiversity and community-based thing, but I think there's a level higher up that we also need to focus on, where adaptation becomes also an economic thing, and making that connection between the physical assets and weather events and economic risk is something we haven't been fantastic at. The other thing we learned from this early project was how collaboratively we can quickly come up with solutions. So what we did in this project is we went around the country, as I said, asking people to identify if they were going to invest similar amounts of money that were being invested in the renewable energy program, but in other things, what would they invest in? And one of the things that came up repeatedly in those workshops was the protection of natural capital, and in particular, water catchments, and in particular vulnerable water catchments. So in South Africa, about 50% of our water is provided by about 12 catchments. And so we trialed this approach called rapid solution development. And so we would get 10 to 15 people in a room, very select group of people, policymakers, finance people, business people, biodiversity specialists, adaptation specialists, and ask them to try to solve particular problems. And in the workshop that looked at these natural capital and in particular water catchment issues, we had the initial problem that there's a disconnect between the ecosystem service that catchment provides and the user. And we focused particularly on the Umgeni catchments in Natal, who provide most of the water that's used by the city of Durban. And there's really no connection between the two. And in fact, the city is very reliant on the functioning of that ecosystem, but has no way to influence the maintenance of that ecosystem. And there are laws in South Africa that prohibit how cities can spend money outside of their boundaries. And so there was some kind of legal obligation and obstructions to that. At the same time, national government had huge public works programs that were operating in these catchments, but that weren't necessarily sustainable. So they would get a grant for a 2 to 3 year period, and you would get lots of small businesses who are doing alien invasive clearing and things like that. But once the grants from the government dried up, those businesses would also dry up and the catchments would return to a sort of degraded state. And no, I'm not saying that this is the answer, but this was the solution that this group came up in a 3-hour facilitated workshop. And their view was you could establish a special purpose vehicle, like an independent financial instrument with its own company registered. And that special purpose vehicle would sign a service level agreement with the city, guaranteeing a certain quality of water at a certain volume at particular points in the catchments. Now, obviously, a catchment is quite large, so there are dams and other things that are in the system. And so that would be a complex service level agreement, but something that is achievable. At the same time, that SPV could then aggregate different kinds of income. So there's obviously income from the city who are now paying for that service level agreement. There's potentially income from the private sector. There's potentially income from international granting associations. And then, of course, you could use that public works money instead of having it on dedicated projects within the catchment, putting that money into the SPV that then is a bigger pot of money with more sustainable revenues that then can fund all kinds of much more sustainable means of keeping that catchment running. As I say, this may be not the perfect solution, but this was a solution that we came up with in 3 hours. And so if we were able to run a process a bit bigger, a bit more focused with a wider range of experts, I'm confident that we can solve these problems. The next project that we ran that was really interesting was called the New Climate of Risk, looking at adaptation risk from a business perspective. And again, to make this point that it often wasn't focused necessarily on ecosystem-based services, but generally trying to get to grips with what the economic risk might look like. And the one risk that I particularly enjoyed and often think of is the fishing industry in the years prior to the study had been based on the west coast of South Africa. And because of warming of oceans, the fish stocks had moved from the west coast around the sort of Cape Point and were now concentrated on the southern coast. And so what the fishing companies were doing, because their infrastructure was already established in the west on the west coast, they would land the fish stocks in Mossel Bay on the south coast, ship them across land in trucks to the processing facilities on the west coast. And again, huge economic inefficiencies there. And that had knock-on impacts on things like banking and finance. And so one of our major banks, First Rand Group, had a particularly shipping advisory center based on the west coast. And of course, they had to move that to the southern coast, which is where the focus had shifted. But basically getting to grips with how do these physical risks translate through the economy into something that impacts economic viability and employment was a key thing that we needed to do. The other thing was working out this thing around storytelling. So getting people engaged with long and complicated presentations was incredibly difficult, but we found that if we did things that are much more simpler and much more easy to follow and take less time to consume, we got a lot more engagement. And so this was an infographic that DFFE and the NBI put together for our COP pavilion a couple of years ago. And we found that that infographic was incredibly useful. And we ended up using it across a whole range of conferences, including big adaptation gatherings globally and in South Africa. The really big breakthrough, though, came when we developed an app that allowed you to interact with the scientific data. And so you'll see in this picture here, a little temperature slider on the right. You could slide that temperature up and down and see what 2 degrees did to biodiversity, to heat stress, and to agricultural output. You could then slide it up to 4 degrees to see what happened, and then slide it up to 6 degrees. And we found that that made a huge difference within our companies, because Practitioners, sustainability practitioners could quickly, in the lift, at the water cooler, in a break between meetings, engage with senior people within business and show them the impact. And that had a big impact on many of our businesses, including financial services providers. So we kind of thought, well, let's take all of that learning and let's put it into a project where we worked with Sambi to try to build a pipeline of adaptation projects. And this work was led by my colleague Rita Metzi, who's been chairing this session so far. And so we had three legs to this thing. We had a capacity building program where we developed a whole bunch of really useful resources, videos online around climate risk, adaptation risk, what is climate finance, what is ecosystem-based services. And again, there, the challenge is getting people to watch those videos. And to some degree, we were hurt by COVID because we couldn't have as many face-to-face sessions as we wanted. But also, I think maybe we forgot this lesson that you need much more simple storytelling in order to get people engaged. The advantage, though, is that we now have this really great resource that you can point people to. So once you get their attention, once you get them engaged in the topic, then there's a fantastic set of resources. The second and third phase of that project was to work with a community of practice, of business, civil society, labor, government, to try to identify a series of adaptation projects that we could take forward and get better funded. Now, my grand audacious goal at the beginning of this project was to identify 3 projects of $50 million a piece, where the private sector is putting in some of that money and you're getting some of that money from government and from international granting processes. Now, the reality was that we couldn't find projects that were big enough. The way that we think in our adaptation community is focused on relatively small community-led projects. And I think that the trick that we've missed is somehow analyzing this economic risk, translating adaptation and physical risk into economic risk, and using that economic risk to really develop huge landscape level programs. And so then I wanted to reflect a little bit on a program we've just recently, we're 2/3 of the way through, in fact, is a huge project that the MBI has done with BUSA and the Boston Consulting Group, looking at adaptation risk in the economy, where we looked at this big scale risk. What happens if you close down the refineries in South Africa by 2030? What does that mean for balance of payments? What does that mean for employment? There are 80,000 people employed across petrol forecourts in South Africa, which is roughly the same amount of people that are employed in coal. And once you got to those kinds of big economic impacts, we found a huge amount of people engaging on the project. We found the reach into government to be much more effective. We found policy making more aligned. But most importantly, we were able to align business around much greater levels of ambition and therefore much greater levels of support for projects. And this is where you start to see big green iron projects, big hydrogen projects, big projects that require 187 billion rand of support, as indicated in the recent deal closed at COP. And it occurred to me that this is what's missing in the adaptation conversation, is driving the same kind of scale. We need to do big things. And maybe to illustrate the scale, on this mitigation project between the MBI and the Boston Consulting Group, we've spent between 30 and 40 million rand just doing the base work. What is the economic impacts? What's the baseline? What kind of models do we need? Who else do we need to include? How do we work with UCT? How do we work with CSIR? And so it's a huge project, and I'm not sure any of us are spending that kind of money just trying to understand the problem. And then the second indicator of scale is just the level of stakeholder engagement. We've had expert workshops with anywhere from 50 to 100 people every 2 to 3 weeks over a period of about 6 to 7 months. We've engaged one-on-one with individual companies, with individual stakeholders over sort of 40 separate meetings. And so the stakeholder engagement, which helps build capacity, helps people get interested, and then points them to the other resources that are available to help them understand the problem, really started to entrench knowledge and understanding in the business sector and got them aligned on focus. And so for me, what is missing is that level of scale in the adaptation space. How do we take advantage of all of the excellent projects that have been mentioned today, all of the amazing knowledge that sits out there in South Africa, alongside what we have is the most incredible science. Our climate scientists are amongst the best in the world. And so how do we take all of this knowledge and build it into a project that is of impressive scale and that is going to identify these $50 million adaptation projects that I aspire after. So just some thoughts, and certainly the NBI is planning on pursuing this level of scale, hopefully working with all of the partners on this call and a whole host of others, so that we're able to start linking adaptation to economic impact and driving significant investment at the right levels of scale. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Ritumetsi.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that presentation. That's one more kind of dot in how we link up all these different initiatives and activities to complete the entire line and that whole ecosystem for implementing adaptation at scale and really responding to South Africa's adaptation and climate resilience needs. We are now moving on to our last two presentations that are looking at strategic partnerships with donors and implementing partners. And to start off with, I'd like to call on Mr. Nicholas Boscher from the Government of Flanders to give us his initial reflections on strategic partnerships with donors. Mr. Boscher, are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you clearly. You're welcome to go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all the participants, to the colleagues who are here present, and also a big thanks to the NBI and the DFFE to invite us to be part of this very nice event. First of all, I'm going to touch very briefly on Flanders so that all the attendees know who this donor is that the previous speakers have been talking about. And then with regard to partnerships, I want to take a step back and to take a bit of a broader look to the framework that we are applying for establishing the partnership with South Africa. And then I would like to briefly touch upon how we shape this partnership and then the implementation of projects. I will not go into detail of the different projects that we are currently financing. So first of all, Flanders is the northern region of Belgium, and given its very decentralized governance structure in Belgium, the different regions in Belgium, they have their own foreign policy, which means that we as a government of Flanders, we also have our own foreign policy, our own ODA finances, and we also make international commitments towards climate financing. And this is an important aspect because development cooperation for most donors is part of their foreign policy and is often an external extension of its domestic policy. And this means that it should fit the national interests. So national interests of partner countries or regions like Flanders can be political, economical, but in our case, we are mainly looking at contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals and also aiming to contribute to international climate finance. The instruments that we apply to implement our development cooperation policy are mainly grants. We try to establish also partnerships through academic collaboration, collaboration between international institutions, but mainly we use grants. The UNFCCC also encourages donors and especially industrialized countries to also seek supplements from private sector. But unfortunately, Flanders, we don't apply loans. And I think we have to take a look at this, and we also have to take a closer look to see how we can also stimulate private sector investments as a complement to the grants we are currently using. But so far, our finance modality is around grants. And this means that we have to make sure that our finances are complying to the ODA regulations and also to the objectives of international climate finance. And I think for partner countries such as South Africa, I think it's important to understand the different modalities that bilateral partner countries or bilateral donors they use, because this will indicate how to align the national interests that exist between the donor country, but then also the recipient country. And it's an important determinant of how the partnership will be established. And I give you an example. South Africa, in its national determined contribution, correctly points to the responsibility of industrialized countries to increase its climate financing, and also points to the need to assist several countries, including South Africa, in climate change adaptation. So if at a higher level partnerships are being established, it's a very useful tool that South Africa can use for pointing to international donors to their responsibility also to assist in climate change adaptation strengthening. So for Flanders, I of course also hope that out of the COP26 an increased commitment will follow for international climate financing, and that then also adequate attention will be provided to climate change adaptation in South Africa. When it comes down to shaping the partnership between Flanders and South Africa, we work via 5-year programs that come with a commitment. Currently, we are in our 3rd country strategy paper for the period 2017-2021, and we've allocated a total of 25 million euros to South Africa. And our interlocutor in South Africa is both National Treasury, but then also as a line ministry, DFFE, and more specifically, the Chief Directorate of Climate Change Adaptation. So when it comes down to the actual allocation of resources and the implementation of the resources, there is a decision structure which have been set up in order to allocate the different funding. We do have a strong, I would say, preference of using budget support or of sectors budget support. But in South Africa, we're not applying this finance modality. This could have given much more leverage to the DFFE, but in South Africa, our government has chosen to implement the financial resources through projects. And we are using a mixed portfolio of projects, and this is a mix that is established between government organizations, as previously indicated by Mr. Ramaya. 4 million euro has been allocated to the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, but we also support other government agencies such as the South African Weather Service, SANBI. We also have collaborations with South African universities. Then as a use of a mix of implementing actors, we also support UN agencies because we believe it's important to bringing the international standards to the countries that we support, but also vice versa. It's also important that South Africa has a strong voice in these UN agencies, and that the experiences and recommendations of South Africa, for example, Steve alluded to the strong research capacity that exists there, that also that experience is taken up internationally and shared with other countries that will be able to use that. And then we also support a range of local NGOs. And the objective of that support is mainly to assist communities in adapting to climate change. When it comes down to coordination and the guidances that is being provided by our interlocutors as the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, my experience is that there is a bit of a need, or let me put it that the different donors that are active in South Africa could benefit a lot from donor coordination. I think as donors, we try to coordinate amongst ourselves and to share information amongst ourselves. But I think the different international organizations that are active here could use that kind of donor coordination to make sure that the different international institutions, they complement each other, but that they also receive the appropriate guidance on where to allocate these resources. Then looking at the different organizations that we finance, if I can reflect on that, it is very clear that the past year has not been easy because of the coronavirus pandemic, but there needs to be a clear strategy on how the absorption of funding can be increased in South Africa. We see throughout all our partner organizations many delays in implementation. We also try to harmonize the efforts of the different organizations that we support, and hence we appreciate a lot of the work that is being done by Indalo to make sure that all the different organizations, they complement and they strengthen each other. But South Africa is a very big country, and there is quite a risk of a fragmented approach towards implementation of climate change adaptation interventions. So this is really something that could be looked at, and to determine how can the absorption of resources be increased, and how can implementation speed can be increased in the country. These are aspects that are quite important for donors and as like for international funding institutions. So I would strongly recommend a reflection to see which are the big agencies in the country that can absorb efficiently resources and produce results, or as a complement, which are the different NGOs which are in the field. Is it possible to make it a network of organizations that collaborate and that can rapidly upscale the interventions they are implementing, so that much faster results can be achieved in the field? I will hold it here. Thank you again for the invitation. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you very much for those reflections on how the government of Flanders is working in South Africa. In our last panel, our last speaker for today is Mr. Gregor Schmall from GIZ, who will also be reflecting on strategic partnerships for implementing climate action. Gregor, please go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Rita. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Fantastic. So thank you very much for having me and providing this opportunity to exchange with such a range of highly dynamic and passionate actors in the field in South Africa in the adaptation space. And yeah, given the time, and I see that many participants I think have been dropping out already, I'll really keep it very short. I think it's just really a message of support from my side. GIZ has been in the country for a long time already, cooperating with South Africa and the DFFE in particular. Our main commissioning entity there is the BMU, the German Federal Ministry for the Environment. And in South Africa, I mean, GIZ has been working on a range of sectors, climate change being one of them, and the DFFE being our main political partner here. Key project here is the Climate Support Program, the CSP, previous programs have been running already since 2009. And I think as I mentioned, we support the DFFE in achieving its ambitious goals in the area of mitigation, adaptation, monitoring, evaluation are some of the topics that we have worked on. And the key areas that we actually work in, if you recall Chloe's presentation at the beginning, I think that's kind of a mirror image of what we have been working on for the last years. In terms of the policy work, the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy is a cornerstone in highlighting the priorities of South Africa for implementation action that we have been working on. And I think it will also very much guide the next 5 years of implementation and adaptation. And that's something, it's a guiding document that we also will look at for what to support. Support to local implementation and local adaptation strategies was a key area that we have been working on. Chloe has mentioned some of the projects there, the provincial climate change plans, the district climate change plans. I think those are all crucial elements of work we have been supporting, but also the research and the science base. I think that was also key for the work in the last 5 years that we have been working on. I'm not going to go into detail of the activities. I think colleagues before me have already touched on some of those. I'm also not going into the examples of projects, again, looking at the time, but I think let me just quickly have a touch on the way forward. The climate support program, that's really our key vehicle for supporting adaptation in South Africa, and the DFFE in its catalytic role has been extended for another 5 years. That will start from January next year onwards. And yeah, we will continue our successful collaboration with a very much heightened focus on implementation of local adaptation. And I think many of the speakers have touched upon it before. I think it was called earlier the middle section there. Mandy, you called it the missing middle. I think that was an interesting concept. It reminds me of the valley of death in a startup, and that's something that we also would want to look at, how we can actually bridge that gap from the idea to something that Steve mentioned, to a programming scale. And because that's, I think, where we have to go, and that is something that we will also focus on in the next phase, is to really start and try to build interventions that have a larger scale and are able to attract climate finance at a larger scale. So I'm very much looking forward to working with all the players that have presented here today, and intensify our conversations around these issues. And I think I'll leave it with that message. And thanks very much. Back to you, Ritu.
Great. Thank you very much, Gregor, and thank you also to Nicholas. We've had a really interesting and diverse set of viewpoints, and also a description of some of the interventions that are taking place that are really trying to make sure that the ecosystem for implementing climate change adaptation action at scale in South Africa is really well established. Noting the time, I'd like to thank everyone who's participated in this session. I'd also like to thank those who joined us online, just to draw your attention to those knowledge products that Sambi has produced and that the links had been provided in the chat. And really thank you for your time today. We will now be closing the session and in anticipation of some of the other events that will be taking place later on today. Thank you everyone for joining us.